Hi everyone, welcome to Global Compliance Panel live webinar on managing the medical device supply chain. My name is Uttam Kumar and I'm going to be your host today. On behalf of the Global Compliance Panel team, I would like to thank you for being a part of this event. Today's webinar will be presented by Dan O'Leary. And Dan O'Leary is the president of OBU Enterprise LLC, an education, training, and consulting company focusing on operational excellence using analytical skills and a systems approach to operations management. Dan has more than 30 years of experience in quality, operations, and program management in regulated industries including aviation, defense, medical devices, and clinical laboratories. He holds a master's degree in mathematics and also an ASQ certified biomedical auditor, quality engineer, reliable engineer, and Six Sigma Black Belt, and is certified by APICS in resource management. We are honored to have such a distinguished person with us today to present this webinar. Well, before we begin, I would like to inform you of the program outlined for this training session. This webinar is for 60 minutes duration. First, Dan will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas that would be covered, and he would then share with you his presentation. We would like to inform that all participants, once part of teleconference, have been placed on mute and will remain so until the question answer begins towards the end of the webinar. It is for the purpose of avoiding discontinuity and allowing the presenter to speak clearly, and so that everyone present can take maximum benefit from this webinar. We also request you all to hold back your questions until the question answer window begins. 10 minutes prior from the time will be allotted for the Q&A, during which your questions will be answered. If for any reason you're logged out of the session or teleconference, please follow the same procedure to join in back again. Now that we are all ready to set, I request Dan to take it from here. Dan?
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to our webinar on managing the medical device supply chain. You'll notice, I'm about to go through the outline of our discussion today, but you'll notice in the lower right-hand corner there's a number for each slide. So if you have a question about a specific slide, note the number, and it's easy for me to jump back to that slide in the question and answer session. So what we're going to talk about today, we're basically going to look at a few things. We're going to start with the FDA's quality system regulation. We're going to look at the regulation, the requirements for purchasing and supply chain management that are in 820.50, and we're also going to discuss something called the preamble, which is going to give us some of the thinking that the FDA had when they published the final version of the regulation. We're also going to look at ISO 13485, and the citation here is probably a little different than the way you're used to seeing it, and we'll explain what that means. Purchasing shows up in clause 7.4, so we'll spend some time looking at what the requirements are there and how to satisfy them. And there's also a guidance document published by ISO that tells us some of their intent in the information in 13485. Lastly, we're going to look at guidance from the Global Harmonization Task Force. So we're going to look at Global Harmonization Task Force, learn a little bit about what their role is, and then look at the guidance document that they've put together on how to manage suppliers and examine the 6 phases that they have to establish supplier control up and down the supply chain. So we're going to look at FDA QSR first, and the QSR comes from the Safe Medical Devices Act of 1990. And in that regulation, in that law, Congress asked the FDA to work with foreign countries for mutual recognition of regulatory requirements. So as a result, FDA rewrote the good manufacturing practices for devices and published them as the quality system regulation. And this was a number of years ago. And so they based them on the ISO documents that were in effect at the time. So we had ISO 9001, this is the U.S. version that's cited here. So this is as was then published in the United States. This was the 1994 version, and 13485 hadn't actually been published yet. So at the time, it was a draft international standard. So that's what DIS means. So QSR is based upon the 1994 version of ISO 9001, and this version had about 20 quality elements. 13485 hadn't been issued. It was a draft standard. So that version added additional information to ISO 9001. It wasn't a standalone document. Since then, ISO 9001 and 13485 have undergone major sets of changes. We've moved from the element approach to the process approach. They've been revised a few times, but QSR has not been updated as a result of those changes. So QSR still looks a lot like the 1994 version of ISO 9001, and we'll see that as we go through some of the requirements. The QSR preamble is really interesting to understand. So the FDA published draft regulations before they published the final version. And when they published the final version, they also explained the comments that they had received, how they reacted to them, and what they were thinking of as they implemented, as they wrote some of the regulatory parts. So these comments are in the preamble, and each one has a number. And we're going to look at some of these comments as we go along because they're going to help us explain what FDA was thinking as they wrote some of the things that sometimes look a little bit strange, and it'll also help us understand some of the terms. So the preamble and the regulations were published in the Federal Register on October 7, 1996. Here's the citation if you want to look it up. There's a lot of reading to it, but a lot of it is pretty interesting if you are trying to understand some of the regulatory issues that people run across on a regular basis. So 21 CFR A20.50 is purchasing controls. And so what I've done up here is cited the requirement, and it says that each manufacturer shall establish and maintain procedures to ensure that all purchased or otherwise received product, and we're going to define what that means, or services conform to specified requirements. So preamble paragraph number or section number 100, and there's hundreds of sections in the preamble as it went through all of the regulations, says that products or services which are purchased or processed in some manner by another organization. So what this means is that this is anything that comes from outside the device manufacturer, and it's got nothing to do with payment. So one of the things that often happens is people ask the question, well, if I get something from inside another division of my company and no payment occurs, I don't actually write a check, is it fall under purchasing? And the answer from FDA is yes. So the issue here is that no matter how you get it, whether you purchase it or otherwise receive it, and you could otherwise receive it from a sister facility or some other corporate or financial affiliate, it all falls under the regulations for purchasing. And servicing means parts of the system that are contracted to others, and it could be outsourced kinds of manufacturing processes that they're suggesting here. So for example, metal plating, testing, services, sterilization. A common one is calibration of test and measuring equipment. All of those things are services, and they are also going to fall under purchasing control. So FDA believes that all of these suppliers of services have to be assessed and evaluated just as if it were a product, and consequently the degree of control needs to be established, and that's basically what we're going to talk about. And at the bottom of the page is the definitions from the beginning of QSR. They're in the this tan-colored text box, and establish means to define, document, and implement. So we'll use these as the way to understand some of the definitions as we go along. So, purchasing controls. Purchasing controls have to be defined in procedures, and based upon what we've seen so far, the procedure should cover 4 different cases. So we might purchase a product, or we might purchase a service, or we might otherwise receive a product, or we might otherwise receive a service. So here's an example of a service. If we belong to a corporate organization, the corporate organization might have some kind of quality auditing function, and they come in and they do quality audits that we incorporate into our management review. That would be a service that's otherwise received because the corporate organization is taking care of it. There's no purchase orders involved, but FDA is expecting that we have control over those kinds of services as well as products. So the preamble, note 102, gives us the one exception, component manufacturers. So remember, components are things that are purchased outside or otherwise received and go into the device, but they are not necessarily a device on their own. So if we're making electronics, for example, resistors, capacitors, transistors, integrated circuits, all of those are kinds of things that are going to be components. What the regulation says is that those manufacturers are not subject to the FDA regulations. What that means is the finished device manufacturer is responsible for everything that that supplier provides. So the responsibility rests with you as the manufacturer for all the components that you buy, all the products you acquire, all the services you get. You are responsible to make sure that they are all correct, and the regulations here are going to define what that means. So QSR has developed this supplier selection approach, and we're going to walk through the supplier selection approach because this is basically how you add suppliers to your supply chain. So the basic elements are to establish the requirements, then evaluate potential suppliers, select suppliers, define the controls that you're going to exercise over those suppliers, and then finally create records of the activities that have taken place. Now, you're really going to create the records all along, but for the simple flow, that's the easy way to describe it. So you have to establish requirements for each supplier, contractor, or consultant. And so we're going to talk about contractors, consultants, and suppliers here in a moment. But basically what you're going to do is write down requirements that each of these entities, suppliers, contractors, or consultants, have to meet as the first step in the supplier evaluation and selection process. And what the preamble says is that medical device companies have hired consultants who just don't understand the areas in which they're consulting. So they added consultants, and this is the only quality management system I know of that particularly calls out consultants as somebody that needs to be evaluated formally, just like any other supplier. For contractors, the easy way to think of contractors is a company that perhaps is doing contract manufacturing for you, or perhaps contract sterilization, or perhaps they're doing test equipment calibration for you. So think about those people as contractors as opposed to suppliers who are providing you components. So there's not a clear-cut distinction here, but that's basically what FDA is thinking when they wrote the regulations and distinguished the 3 kinds of organizations: suppliers, contractors, and consultants. So what you need to do is establish the requirements before you start the selection process. That means define, document, and implement these requirements. They're going to change based upon the product or service, as well as the role of who you're evaluating, supplier, contractor, or consultant. And as we mentioned, QSR requires that you formally evaluate consultants, whereas the other quality management systems don't call out consultants explicitly. Now you're going to evaluate these suppliers. So you're going to evaluate them on the basis of their ability to meet specified requirements. So remember, you just wrote what the requirements were on the last slide. Now what you're going to do is evaluate the suppliers, potential suppliers, and I'm going to use suppliers as generic term for supplier, contractor, and consultant. You're going to evaluate each one of those against the criteria. In other words, you're going to essentially say, can this supplier meet my requirements, or does this supplier fall short in some way? And quality requirements means the quality control and quality assurance procedures and standards and so on that are required to make sure that you get the product or service that you're contracting for. So you're going to identify potential suppliers, evaluate them based upon your requirements, which remember are written down, formal requirements established and approved before you start the evaluation process. You're going to compare the capability and capacity of these suppliers, these potential suppliers, against your requirements, and you're going to keep records of how the comparison came out. So every time you evaluate a supplier against the criteria you've set up, you're going to write down how that evaluation came out. Now you're going to select suppliers. So you're going to select them on their ability to meet the specified requirements. And basically what's going to happen is you're going to select typically one. So you might evaluate 3 to 5 suppliers, and typically you're going to select one supplier. You may choose to select more than one supplier depending upon the criticality of the product, the risk that you might be willing to take, the capacity of the potential supplier. But typically people try to keep the supplier base very small, so you're going to select just one supplier. And you're going to select the supplier that best fits the requirements that you established at the beginning. And best fits is kind of a complex problem, but basically what you're going to do is make sure that you have the requirements that you need satisfied, or, as we're going to look at here, controls in place to make sure that things are going to come out the way you need them to come out. So the requirement is that you're going to define the type and extent of control that you're going to exercise over the product that you're going to get, the service you're going to get, the supplier, contractor, or consultant who's going to provide it, and you're going to decide on the controls you need based upon the evaluation results that you've just completed. So you're going to evaluate the suppliers. In some cases, they're going to fall short of your requirements, so you're going to impose additional controls upon the supplier or on the product or service. So manufacturers have to clearly define the type and extent of control. And we're going to look at some examples, but basically you might have to provide greater in-house controls to ensure the products and services meet requirements. So I'll give you an example. If you have a supplier and you have some doubt about the capability of their process to meet your requirements, then what you might do is impose additional incoming inspection, for example. So that would be the kind of control that you might impose on a product or on a supplier. So basically, you're going to evaluate these suppliers and establish controls on some combination of the supplier, the contractor or consultant, and the product or service that you're going to obtain. And the controls then are going to apply in some combination to either the product or service or to the organization that's going to provide it. And remember, these are not necessarily just external organizations. So here's some examples. You might establish an incoming inspection sampling plan. If you have some doubts about the material, you might send critical components to an independent test lab. Now remember, the test lab is going to be a supplier to you, so you have to evaluate them as well. For services, contract sterilization, processes have to be validated. You might want to look at process parameters. Similarly, for calibration services, you want to make sure that the lab is fully qualified to do the work that you're going to do, and you might ask them for reports about what they found that you can review. For suppliers, contractors, and consultants, you might find whether or not they've got a registered quality management system and obtain all of the information from their third-party audits, or you might conduct second-party audits yourself on a regular basis. So the capability needs to be reviewed at intervals consistent with the significance of the product to demonstrate conformance to specified requirements. So you've got specified requirements. You need to be evaluating these suppliers at regular intervals. Lastly, you're going to create records. So you have to keep records of everything that you've done. So when you evaluate, select, monitor, measure, all of those things need to be reflected in records. And records include any supplier audits you performed. And then just as an aside, if the FDA comes in to inspect, you do not have to provide the supplier audit reports to the FDA inspectors, but they might ask you to certify that you actually conducted the audits, particularly if you've written your procedures that you're going to audit suppliers on a regular basis. They're going to expect that you've actually followed the procedure that you wrote. Next, we're going to look at purchasing data. This is in Part B. We're going to establish and maintain purchasing data, and we're also going to look at some issues of change control. So you have to establish and maintain data that clearly describes or references the specified requirements. So in other words, what you need to do is somehow define the product that you're going to purchase, and that's purchasing data. Now, there's this odd comment that FDA does not believe that this prohibits the use of drawings or prints, assuming that the documents contain the data clearly described. One of the issues was whether or not a drawing or a print could count as data. Somebody was thinking that perhaps it had to be all written down in words instead of drawings or pictures. The FDA is saying, no, that's not the case. You can have written or electronic means to establish the purchasing information, so it doesn't all have to be written on paper. You can have it in some electronic fashion. What's really important is that you have it. So you have to have a document that describes or refers to the requirements, and typically what you're going to do is put this as an attachment or a reference on a purchase order. So FDA also commented that the specifications for many components are so well established that the trade name is sufficient to describe the material needed. So in that case, you don't have to have long involved purchasing specifications, particularly for describing a common material. You can just use the trade name of the product. So this is going to give you a little bit of relief in terms of establishing the data, but what this means is that when you specify this material, you know exactly what it is that you're specifying, and then you're just specifying it by the trade name. Purchasing data has to be approved in accordance with 820.40. 820.40 is the section on document control, and basically what that means is every one of these things that are going to define a product have to go through the document control system to be reviewed and approved. And this is for any product or any service. So you have to review all of this purchasing data before it's released. That is, you can't use unapproved data in a purchase order, for example. But they do say that you don't have to approve every purchasing transaction. You just have to have the underlying purchasing data approved. So this means that documents have to be reviewed and approved by designated individuals prior to being issued, and you're not supposed to use them to purchase product until after they've been reviewed, approved, and issued. Change control. This is a funny one. Purchasing documents shall include, the FDA says, where possible, and we're going to talk about where possible, an agreement that the suppliers, contractors, or consultants agree to notify the manufacturer of changes in the product or service so that you, the manufacturer, can determine whether or not that change is going to affect the quality of a finished device. So what this is basically saying is that the FDA expects you as the manufacturer to have each one of your suppliers agree that they're not going to make any changes in the product without having notified you. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you get to approve the changes that your suppliers make, particularly if you're buying OEM products, things that are off the shelf. You're probably not going to have enough control over those kinds of suppliers in order to get into the approval process. But what they're suggesting is if the supplier doesn't agree then that might make the supplier unacceptable. So if the product is in short supply and must be purchased, maybe what you need to do is tighten your controls in other ways. So, but the issue here is that the FDA is expecting that you will have control over suppliers' changes, at least to the extent that you're being notified. You may not have approval over the changes, but at least you know what's going to happen, that you're going to evaluate those changes, and presumably every time you evaluate each notification, you're going to determine its impact on the quality of the finished device to the extent that you can. And my recommendation is to leave a record behind of each evaluation that you make so that you can demonstrate to the FDA that you've actually implemented this thing as required. All right, we're going to turn our attention now to ISO 13485, and we'll talk about the similar corresponding requirements there. Now, 13485 is at the 2003 version. It replaced ISO 13485-1996, and there is this correction to the current version. And basically what the correction does is once the new version of ISO 9001 came out, the 2008 version, people realized that in 13485, it didn't tell what version of ISO 9001 was incorporated into 13485. So what this change does is clarify that 13485-2003 is based on the 2000 version of ISO 9000, not the 2008 version. In the European Union, which you know because there's an EN in front of the standard, there is also a change, and this is a technical change relative to the way the medical device directive modules are set up for the approval of products. And so it doesn't have any real impact in terms of the requirements in 13485, but it does clarify a little bit about how some of these approval processes work. And then lastly, ISO published a technical report, that's what TR means, that's a guidance document. So it tells you how to apply ISO 13485-2003. And it's worth looking at if you're involved in 13485 and you want to clarify some of the issues that showed up there. So there's a convention here. 13485 is based upon ISO 9001, and when they differ, 13485 shows the differences in blue italics. So we're going to use the same convention. So for the most part, everything we're going to talk about is going to apply to either ISO 9001 or 13485 with a few minor changes which are shown in blue italics. So one of the first changes is that in 13485, the organization has to establish documented procedures to ensure that purchased product conforms to requirements. So that's in blue italics, so that's not a requirement phrased exactly that way in ISO 9001. In ISO 9001, you don't have to have documented procedures. In 13485, you do. And the guidance document says this is establishing a criteria, evaluating, selecting, and ongoing monitoring of suppliers. In other words, it's very similar to what we just talked about in QSR. Here is the process from clause 7.4.1 by which we're going to select suppliers. It's very similar to what we looked at. We're going to establish criteria, evaluate potential suppliers, select them, define controls, create records, and then monitor their performance. So we have to establish the criteria for selection, evaluation, and reevaluation, and these should be done in writing, just as we looked at in QSR. So the idea here is that you're going to show that you have control over the supplier by establishing these criteria and then actually following them. The criteria for reevaluation is also in this clause. This is a little different than what we saw in QSR, but basically the ongoing evaluation of suppliers is going to follow a similar set of criteria that are established like the selection and evaluation criteria. So now we're going to evaluate potential suppliers. And here the guidance document gives us a few examples. We're going to test samples potentially, look at third-party evaluation reports. This could be, for example, if the supplier has a ISO 9001 certificate, we might ask to see the audit results from their notified body or their organization that granted the certificate. We might look at historical data, certification of the quality management system, or we might go and audit the supplier's quality management system. So these are ways that we're going to gain information to help us evaluate the potential suppliers. We're going to select them based upon their ability to provide product in accordance with the organization's requirement. Selection criteria was set up in an earlier step, and in the ISO system, product includes services. So services and product are all specific terms. The generic term is product in the ISO system. So they're talking about essentially suppliers, contractors, and consultants, because consultants provide services, although it's not named explicitly, and many people wouldn't include consultants in the 1345 system. We're going to define controls. This is the control that we're going to have over the purchased product, and it's going to show up in our product realization system. So we're going to evaluate suppliers, and we're going to exercise controls. And here's some examples of various kinds of suppliers that might fall under the controls that we're going to establish. So we might have a design and development service, clinical evaluation, testing and calibration, off-the-shelf component suppliers, contract sterilizers, and so on. So think of control as written in a risk-based manner based upon the effect of the purchased product on the effect of the final product, that is, on the medical device that we're going to deliver. So this control mechanism is an application of risk management. What you need to do is identify some of the risks that can happen if the supplier doesn't meet the requirements that you've established, and then mitigate those risks using the defined controls. As always, in any quality management system, you're going to keep records. So you want to keep records of your evaluations and reevaluations of your criteria and so on. And if as part of the control mechanisms you have to take actions, so for example, you might have to send a corrective action request to somebody further down in the supply chain, then you want to make sure that you keep a record of those activities, because that's going to be part of the objective evidence that you are managing your supplier base, managing the supply chain appropriately. Now we're going to look at this criteria for reevaluation. Remember, it showed up earlier, but basically this is where monitoring is going to take place. So you're going to monitor supplier performance. And some things the guidance document says to consider is the third-party certification status, their conformance history, compliance trends. So any information that you have is going to enter into the reevaluation of the supplier. So remember, this is an example of monitoring and measuring of the type that shows up in 13485. The third bullet in here says you should include in the supplier monitoring activities the need for their registration body to visit the supplier. What they're suggesting is if your registration, if you've got a registered 13485 system, you might ask your registrar to go visit your suppliers. Now, I don't know of anybody that actually does that, and it's going to cost you something to have it done. So usually this is going to amount to an audit, and so it might be a more cost-effective for you to do the audit. But one case where it does often happen is in contract sterilization. So you might actually end up having your notified body need to visit your contract sterilizer, because that's such a critical part of your product realization process for the medical device. Purchasing information, this is the purchasing data that we looked at in QSR. So purchasing information has to describe the product to be purchased, including requirements for approval of product, procedures, processes, and equipment, requirements for qualification of personnel, and the quality management system requirements. This kind of product, process, equipment, and personnel approval tends to show up where there is a validated process involved. So you might impose upon your supplier or on your supplier's supplier, because remember we're talking about the full supply chain, a requirement for validated processes that they have to use the approved equipment, that they have to have trained personnel who understand how to perform the process. So this is the kind of information that you would impose upon your supplier in a contract or a purchase order, and you also might impose a quality management system requirement. So for example, you might require that your supplier have an ISO 9001 system or an ISO 13485 system, depending upon what's appropriate for the kind of product or service that that supplier is providing to you or to your supplier, because remember, we're talking about the whole supply chain. So these requirements may extend further down the supply chain than just to the Tier 1 suppliers. You have to ensure that your specified purchase requirements are adequate, and basically the way to do it is to put them through the review and approval process of the document control system. It's not a requirement in 13485, but it certainly is a best practice to make sure that you have methods to review and approve these documents, that they're under document control, and that you have means to ensure that you send the correct revision to the supplier. You don't want to be changing the documents, improving them, and then fail to have them adequately represented at the point of use. That is either not referenced properly in the purchase order or not sent to the supplier for their implementation. Traceability. So traceability shows up as one of these things that's in 13485. That's not in ISO 9001. So you have to maintain relevant purchasing information, for example, documents and records. And the purchasing documents may need to identify the traceability requirements, particularly if you need to make sure that you know the specification revision of the part that you've ordered. This information is going to be in the purchasing documents or records. Identification of product by lot, batch, or serial number means that you can trace in two directions. You can trace forward to the customer. This is what 13485 calls device tracking. In FDA regulations, device tracking has got a slightly different meaning. Or you can trace backward to the raw materials. So if you have a problem, you'd like to know who got the product that might incorporate that problem item, or if you have a problem on the manufacturing floor, you might like to be able to trace the information back to a particular purchase order, back to a particular lot of material that you received. So basically, traceability is one of the requirements that shows up for medical devices in 13485 and the associated records that doesn't show up in ISO 9001. All right, so now we've looked at the two most common quality management systems for medical devices that U.S. companies employ, and also a lot of European companies, because remember, many organizations operate in multiple regulatory environments. It's quite common for U.S. manufacturers, for example, to market product in the U.S., the same product in the European Union, and the same product in Canada, all of which have slightly different changes and additions and differences in their requirements. Well, this raises a big issue for a lot of people. So the Global Harmonization Task Force is an organization that's attempting to harmonize regulations around the world. So their website is here, www.ghtf.org. It was started in 1992, as an effort to harmonize regulations around the globe. And it's a voluntary group. And recently, well, 2006, their membership expanded to include some other organizations, including ISO and IEC, who are major standards organizations in the world. So there's these other organizations are represented in the Global Harmonization Task Force. GHTF is divided up into study groups, and they produce guidance documents. And so here are the 5 study groups that are currently operating in GHTF, and we're going to look at least one of their guidance documents as we look at what GHTF is recommending in this area of supplier control. So the one we're primarily interested in is this document called Guidance on the Control of Products and Services Obtained from Suppliers. So it's published by Study Group 3. It's document number N17, and it came out in 2008. And it is very well known to the FDA. The FDA has representatives in the Global Harmonization Task Force. And I've been to conferences recently with FDA people who are stressing the importance of understanding what's in the Global Harmonization Task Force guidance documents. They're not regulations in the U.S. They're not guidance documents in the U.S., but the FDA is making major contributions to them, and it somehow reflects a lot of the FDA thinking about how to manage the issues, the subjects of the guidance documents, suppliers control in this case. There's another guidance document that's also very interesting. It's N15, and it's up at Revision 8. It's risk management principles. And we've talked about the fact that a lot of supplier management is actually an application of risk management. So what we'd like to do is make sure that we understand what's going on with risk management inside the quality management system. Now, this is different than risk management for the medical device. So if you look at ISO 14971, it tells you how to manage device risk. This guidance document tells you how to manage quality management system risk. So there's a difference. The concepts of risk management are pretty common to both systems, but this is a different document, and it has some very different focus in terms of where it applies. And then lastly, process validation is also very important, because one of the things that you might be purchasing from a supplier is product that comes from a process that requires validation. So understanding the common issues of process validation can help you in managing the supply chain. So we're going to look at N17, the guidance document from the Global Harmonization Task Force on control of products and services from suppliers. It's divided into 6 phases, and this is going to be pretty familiar by now. Each phase has a set of associated activities, and the guidance document does something that the other things haven't done. They give examples of objective evidence that you can use to show how that you've accomplished each activity. So here are the 6 phases of the guidance: planning, selection of potential suppliers, evaluation and accepting those suppliers, controls, monitoring, measuring of the delivery of the suppliers, and feedback and communication. So there is in the guidance document a very large flow chart. It takes up at least a full page, and I've broken it into pieces so that we can look at each piece as it relates to the 6 phases. So planning provides a direction for establishing the extent of controls, and these kinds of plans, it says, are typically documented in as part of the quality management system. And so the activities are: describe what's going to be obtained, that is, what are you going to purchase; identify any technical and process information. So describe what's going to be obtained, identify process information, technical documentation, identify potential suppliers, identify the risks associated with that product, and identify the kinds of controls that you would need to impose on the supplier or the product in order to help mitigate those risks. And here is a list of objective evidence that you might maintain to demonstrate that you have performed the activities that are part of the planning phase. And this is similarly how it's going to go for all of the other issues. So an outcome of planning is going to facilitate the identification of the product or services that are required. Now, if you're involved in design, think of this as coming out of the design phase. So this can include components, raw materials, metrology requirements, sterilization, cleaning, so the variety of products or services that you need to realize your product, you're going to identify them in the planning activities phase. And here are some examples. And we're not going to go through all of the examples, but basically off-the-shelf products are your basic hardware, electronic components, and so on. You might have parts and components made to your specifications. You might have software that's involved. You might have services that you're going to obtain from suppliers. Sterilization we've talked about a couple of times. Contract manufacturing is also very important. Calibration is a major service. Environmental monitoring, particularly if you're involved in sterilization activities. And then finally, you might actually be buying medical devices that you're going to incorporate into your medical device, or that are going to be associated in somehow with your medical device. So finished devices or components such as X-ray tubes or ECG cables that are really critical components to your suppliers. So these are examples of the things that you might be thinking about in your planning phase. Technical and process information, what do you need in order to make sure that this thing works? What kind of information, what kind of technical capabilities, how do you describe the product? Those are all critical in the technical and process information realm. In identifying potential suppliers, who's going to provide this product? And remember, suppliers could be internal or external. You could be manufacturing it yourself. You could be purchasing it from a sister division. You could be purchasing it from some organization that's got a financial link to your parent company. So you need to think about where all these potential suppliers are going to come from. Then you're going to identify risks, and here's some risk management things to think about. Is it a custom-built part or is it off the shelf? How critical is the component? Does the supplier currently manufacture parts that are used in regulated industries? If they're in the regulated industry for the first time, there's probably going to be a lot of risk of misunderstanding the technical requirements. And so what you might want to do in those cases is apply 14971 as part of the risk management for the device, extend it to the component suppliers, extend it to the contract manufacturers, and so on. And also make sure that you understand and 15 to mitigate the risk in your quality management system. Then you're going to develop a set of controls. The risks are going to lead you into a set of controls. So once you know what the risk is, you ask yourself the question, what can I do to keep that problem from happening? Or if it were to happen, what can I do to mitigate the impact of that risk? And there's a long list of controls that show up in all of these documents, and these documents are well worth going through to have an understanding of the risk issues and how to control and mitigate risk. Now we're going to select potential suppliers, so we're in phase 3.2. What you want to do is investigate their business and operational capabilities. Remember, you don't want to select a supplier that's in financial trouble and is going to go out of business in 6 months. You don't want to select a supplier that is in trouble with OSHA because they're going to get fined, they might get shut down. Similarly, if they're in trouble with EPA, you want to make sure that you understand what's going on. So it's more than just their capability and capacity to supply the parts. You need to understand the whole business capability to make sure that the supplier you select is going to be in business to provide the parts when you need them. So This is business capability, operational capability, and you're going to do those evaluations, and eventually you're going to select the supplier. So we've talked a little bit about this stuff. Make sure that you understand the business capabilities. Make sure that they have the ability to deliver safe and effective devices and that they're financially viable. You want to look at their operational capability. Can they satisfy your lead times? Can they make on-time deliveries? If you have a problem, will they respond quickly? And then finally, you're going to take all of those criteria and you're going to select a potential supplier by evaluating them against your predefined criteria and the capability investigation that you just conducted. Now we're going to evaluate and accept the supplier. Accepting a supplier in this case means actually supplier selection. We're going to select the supplier. So one of the big questions is it a single source supplier? Do we need to make process improvements? And basically what we're going to do is go through all of these criteria and ask ourselves, are they going to be an acceptable supplier before we make the final choice? So we're going to plan on how to evaluate them. Remember, we're going to look at competencies and capacity. You need to consider a combination of these factors. You need to evaluate risk and the potential impact on your device. You're going to communicate with the potential suppliers. You're going to give them the requirements, and perhaps you're going to ask for a first article. Perhaps you're going to ask for prototypes as part of the evaluation. Now, you're not going to ask that of everybody that might be on your list, but now we're down to the very short list of suppliers. You're going to evaluate their ability to meet your selection criteria based upon all of the things that you've done, first articles, prototypes, perhaps you've done audits, perhaps you've evaluated how well they satisfy other customers. And then lastly, you're going to accept the supplier. Accept the supplier means that you're going to find this supplier to be acceptable, so they're going to be your supplier of choice. Then you're going to finalize controls. So this is all of the stuff we've talked about. You have evaluated the supplier against your requirements. You know where they exceed your requirements. You know where they fall short. You've put risk mitigation plans in place. You're going to turn those things into controls that you're going to use to make sure that those risks don't happen or that you can mitigate the effect of those risks. So here's some examples. You're buying a sterile product as a component for a kit where the kit is also going to be sterilized. So the supplier for your sterile product utilizes a contract sterilizer. You may want to make sure that you're conducting audits or reviewing evaluations of this sub-tier sterilization supplier. You might be very concerned about a validated process. So you want to make sure that you have all of the information that demonstrates that your potential supplier has done all of the appropriate process validations and that you have access to all of the records. And this wants to continue on down the supply chain, because the validated parts out of your supplier's supplier may have a potential detrimental impact on your ability to produce the kinds of device that you're after. Here's a bunch of other risk management techniques, acceptance and verification activities. You want to understand whether or not there's been any product recalls from your suppliers, and if so, how have they dealt with them. With internal suppliers, you may not have contractual agreements or purchase orders. You know, this is where maybe you get something from a corporate organization or a sister division. But you need to make sure that you understand how these processes work and that you've got them standardized so that you utilize the same principles for internal suppliers that you use for external suppliers, although it might not be quite so formal because you don't have purchase orders and contracts and such. Delivery measuring and monitoring, you want to make sure that you understand what's going on. You're going to receive the product to service. You're going to accept it. You're going to conduct measuring and monitoring. You're going to analyze the data, and that's eventually going to lead you to periodic evaluation of the supplier. So then you want to get into feedback and communication phases. If you have identified a problem, you want to make sure that that problem goes into feedback and communication. That problem perhaps ends up in corrective or preventive action. And without problems, you just want to periodically reevaluate the supplier. You want to make sure that that supplier understands the results of your evaluation, what it means, what they could do better, where they're doing exceptionally well. CAPAs are a particular issue, and by CAPA, preventive action isn't such important, but corrective action means that you've had a nonconformance and you're looking for the supply chain to make sure that that problem never happens again. So you really want to reevaluate the continued stability of the supplier. If you have a problem and you're working corrective actions with that supplier, you want to make sure that you understand exactly what's going on with that supplier, that they really do have the capability and the capacity to work with you to make sure that this problem doesn't happen again. So there's a set of responsibilities that the GHTF suggests for CAPAs, but basically the overall responsibility resides with you as the medical device manufacturer. You own the problem, you own the product, so it's your responsibility to make sure that your suppliers are working quite closely with you to resolve any nonconformities and bring corrective actions to an effective and timely closure. So we're going to go into summary and conclusions, and then we'll open it up for questions. So in summary, we've looked at 3 systems for selection and control of suppliers, and we've seen how they can extend up and down the supply chain. You don't have to restrict yourself to the first-tier suppliers. You can either be picking second-tier suppliers, or you can be imposing similar requirements on your first-tier suppliers on how they select second- and third-tier suppliers. 2 of the systems we looked at are regulatory requirements, FDA QSR for the U.S., ISO 13485 primarily for the European Union and Canada, and we've also looked at the international guidance documents that come out of GHTF. We saw how these supplier selection activities are lined up, and so in the summary slide I've shown all 3 sets from QSR 13485 and GHTF. By now you should recognize that they are all variations on a theme. They're very similar in terms of the approach that they take. We saw that there are also differences amongst the 3 systems. Global Harmonization Task Force is the most expansive one, but what's really important is that there are no contradictions amongst the systems. There isn't a system that requires you to do one thing where another system prohibits you from doing it. The systems are complementary, so that means that they add up to provide elements, and if you satisfy the GHTF system, for example, you'll satisfy the other 2 systems as well. So the overarching message here is that your company, as the company that puts the device on the market, has the final responsibility for everything. And the suppliers may have an important role, but in the end, the regulators are going to hold you responsible. You, as the organization putting the device on the market, has the final responsibility to make sure things are right and the final authority to take action along the supply chain. So, conclusion, effective management of the supply chain is not easy. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Planning is the key to success. You need to make sure that you have defined the expectations for every combination of supplier and product, and that is supplier in the broad sense, suppliers, contractors, and consultants, product in the broad sense of physical product and services, and there also is an expectation that those same level of controls apply internally to your organization, that if you have a sister facility that provides products or services, that you have the same levels of control, even though you might you might not be actually writing purchase orders or exchanging checks through accounts payable, for example, as you would with an external supplier. The same control requirements exist. So we're going to open it up for questions. So if there are any questions, we'll open up. And also, you can contact me if a question occurs later. Through Global Compliance Panel, they know how to get a hold of me, and I'm happy to answer questions that might come up. You know, you go away and you think about a problem tomorrow. You say, gee, I really wished I'd asked it. Well, contact me through GHTF, and we can ask it. And here is some material that is upcoming, some of the webinars that I'm going to do. So let's open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dan. Actually, there was some technical problems, so I couldn't respond at the right time. Firstly, I would like to thank Dan for that wonderful presentation, and also all the participants for cooperating with us. And as Dan said, it's time for the question and answers. So with your permission, Dan, could I open up all the lines?
Yes, please.
Okay, sure. Just give me a moment here.
Okay, so all the lines should be open. Are there any questions? Anything that I've talked about that you need a little bit of clarification, or you have an instance in your company that you'd like to discuss? Feel free.
Okay, if for any reasons, if you're unable to ask your questions, either you can just put your hand on the raise hand button, or you can send your question by chat, which would be directed to me, and I'll direct it to Dan. Meanwhile, we sincerely request you to share your feedback in the feedback form that will appear on your screen in the polling panel right now. The feedback form has just 6 questions, mostly multiple choice in nature, and wouldn't take 2 minutes of your time to answer them. The polling will remain open till the end of the session, and you can answer it even after the question and answer is over. We would be grateful if you could stay back a little longer and complete this feedback for us. And here I have and I have unmuted all. If anybody has questions, you can please ask it to Dan. The lines are open right now.
So let me prime the pump. What this means is that everybody who is involved in the supplier selection process has a nice written document that defines the criteria that you're looking for when you evaluate a new supplier. And moreover, if you're involved in design and development, that your design engineers understand this requirement and that they actually follow it. What does anybody think? All right, I don't think we're going to get many questions today.
Yes, I see there's nobody sending me chat questions also, via chat. So, Dan, is that okay? We would conclude the session over here.
Yes, yep. Remember that you can contact me later if a question occurs, so feel free.
Yes, of course. Everyone, you can contact us if you have any questions. You can just contact us on webinars@globalcompliancepanel.com, and I shall forward that question to Dan, and you would get your answers via mails. Well, we are grateful to all of you for taking part in this webinar. And you can get in touch with us the same email address. That would be webinars@globalcompliancepanel.com. And if any of you feel that your team members, colleagues, friends might be benefited from this webinar, we are happy to inform you that it will be available in the recorded format and can be purchased from our website, or you can call us at 800-447-9407. And we welcome all your suggestions and feedback or ideas on how we can improvise our webinar. If you would like to suggest a topic or desire a customized corporate training online or on-site, we ensure that whatever is your training necessity, it will be our priority. We look forward for having you in with us again sometime soon and for your continuous patronage. On behalf of our presenter, Dan O'Leary, and the Global Compliance Panel team, I would like to say thank you for participating in this webinar and wish you a wonderful day ahead. And please, we sincerely request you to share your feedback in the feedback form that is there. We'd be grateful if you could stay back a little longer and complete the feedback for us.